Hey guys, this is Bonnie, and I am starting a new monthly series with you guys, taking you through my garden and just showing you what is going on from month to month. I think that it's important that you guys understand that failures happen. Nobody's garden is perfect, and we have our own struggles, but also that there's great variations in gardening practices across the country. If you're not aware, I am gardening in Central Florida, and our growing seasons are a lot different from most of the country. We are pretty much completely backwards. We are currently in July, and July is kind of our off season for growing. This is when a lot of us have a tendency to let our gardens rest. There are very few things that we can grow in the summer. We can grow some tropical plants and native plants, but for the most part, most of our traditional vegetables just do not handle the heat and humidity very well. Plus, our bugs do not die, and so they, while they are a nuisance in the winter, they are manageable. And in the summer, they become a lot less manageable. So that's a big reason why a lot of us take a break, is just because it's just too difficult. It's a lot of work, and it's very, very difficult to stay on top of, especially if you are growing organically, because most of organic gardening is prevention. And if you are not out here 2 or 3 times a day picking bugs off of plants and applying and reapplying our organic pesticides and fungicides, which, because they are organic, they are non-persistent, which means that every time we get rain, they wash off, and we get rain almost every single day. And so it's just not practical. And it becomes very, very expensive if you are reapplying every single time it rains. So that's a big reason why we take the summer off. Also, if you can't notice behind me, weeding has become a challenge because the weeds do very, very well with all of this wet, hot weather. And so they are growing very quickly. I am actually out here today to do a little bit of a reset. I'm going to do some weeding and kind of start preparing for my fall garden. There are some things that we can start growing in July for our fall gardens, namely our hot weather vegetables that are a longer season vegetable. So we're looking at tomatoes, peppers, eggplants are the main 3. Most of the other stuff we're going to hold off until August. Even, getting into melons and pumpkins, I probably could start them now, but I'm going to go ahead and hold off a little bit, mainly because we are getting so much rain that I don't want them to end up dying from too much rain. So we're just going to kind of take a look at everything, and you guys can kind of see where we're at this month. Okay, so first off, we're going to talk about what is working, and that would be my melons. This bed does need a little bit of attention. I do have some weeds coming up in here, and so I'm going to be working on that tonight. But I have this vine here, if you can see this, is a sugar baby watermelon. And I actually have a little melon that's growing back here. See if I can get some of these leaves out of the way so you guys can see this. Tell you what, I can just very gently pick it up here. This is a little sugar baby watermelon. Not quite ready yet, but it has been enjoying all of the rainfall that we've been getting. And then if we come a little further back here, I realize this gets a little more difficult to see. And this is, hang on, this was a broccoli that hadn't been pulled up yet. This back here is a Ha-Ogan melon, which is kind of like a honeydew, but they are very heat tolerant, popular in the Middle East. And it was struggling a little bit at the beginning of the summer. I wasn't sure exactly what was going on with it. I think that just because of where I planted it and where my irrigation lines up, I don't think it was getting enough water. But since we've been getting so much rainfall, it's actually starting to take off again, and I have some new blooms on it. It's starting to put out tendrils looking for stuff to grab onto, so that's really good progress. I have lots of sawgrass growing here. And then along the back, I'm sure it's probably hard to tell with all of the other weeds that are also growing, is I actually have some carrots that we had planted as seeds back in the spring. They didn't really take off that well, but probably, again, I don't think I was watering them quite enough, but since we've been getting all of the rain and stuff, they've really been taking off. I'm not sure what the roots look like. I haven't really dug in to investigate, but I'm kind of just letting them go for now. Alright, these very sad looking greens here are what is left of my Swiss chard. Swiss chard will do pretty well in the summer. It is a rather heat tolerant green that we can grow, but I have a lot of issues with snails that I had kind of let get away from me, hadn't been treating. So that is why these leaves are so eaten up. I could possibly treat for the snails and keep an eye on these, trim them back, and they might still grow from the center, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and pull them up and start over. Here you can also see where I have some sweet potatoes that are growing through the bed. They actually came up on one end and kind of came up the side of the bed and are growing across it. I make the joke a lot of times that I've only intentionally planted sweet potatoes once, and this is a very good example. I planted them in the ground. This was when we were kind of between raised beds, and they ended up taking off. They ended up spreading all over the place, and they did not stay confined to that one area that I planted them in. So every year since, I've had sweet potato vines pop up wherever they want. And one thing I will say about sweet potatoes is that if you do not harvest all of them, if you leave just a little bit of potato left or a little bit of root left, they will come back the next year and you will figure out where they were. So it's not necessarily a bad problem to have. The sweet potatoes grow well and they only come up in the summer, so I really don't have to mess with them or worry about them in the winter time. And they make a nice ground cover. I have some sweet potatoes that are actually growing in my flower bed in front of my house, again, on accident. And the greens, if you want, you can actually eat the leaves as greens. Something has been eating these leaves, again, probably the snails. We haven't really had any deer or anything like that come through. They have eaten the leaves off of my sweet potatoes in the past. I've also had times when my horses have gotten out, they've eaten the leaves off my sweet potatoes. So there's, everybody likes to eat sweet potato leaves. So that's one lesson learned. All right, let's chalk this one up to a pleasant surprise. I have always heard that cucumbers do not do well in Florida. They're very difficult to get the timing right, and they are susceptible to a lot of pests in the summer. We end up with pickle worms, squash bugs, a lot of the things that are typically also affecting our squash plants, especially like my zucchini, that I lost all of my zucchini. Same types of things can go after our cucumbers. But despite the fact that I lost about half of my cucumber vines, the cucumber vines that are still growing are doing very, very well. I'm still struggling with keeping squash bugs off of them. I actually just picked a couple of squash bugs off of one of the plants, but they are continuing to bloom. They don't, in fact, hang on, more squash bugs. I'll throw those in some soapy water in just a second. And they're gonna start stinking pretty bad in a second. When the squash bugs get scared, they're similar to stink bugs, and so they will let off a scent to try to scare you away, and they end up like kind of staining my fingers yellow if I catch a whole bunch of them at one time. And anyway, long story. Okay, back to my cucumber plants. So yes, we still struggle with the squash bugs, keeping them off, but I have not had really any issues with powdery mildew on the leaves. That was a big thing that affected most of my squash plants. And I can tell where the squash bugs are getting into some of the vine because some of the vine is dying off. but the rest of the vine is still going strong. So I have this one here that is going up this trellis that we built for it. The trellis itself is actually about 6 feet tall. It has this trellis netting on it that we've stapled to it. And you can see here, this is a Market More cucumber. So I have one nice mature cucumber that's growing right here. Still waiting for it to finish filling out. But I have several little female blooms on here that will hopefully be more cucumbers. We really like cucumbers around here, so this is exciting. I'm not sure if any of my pickling cucumbers survived, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and start some more cucumbers from seed. It's late in the season, but I think that we could probably go well into the fall with them if they continue to do this well. Okay, so this is in the same bed as my cucumbers. You can see over here I have some cucumbers growing up the trellis. But I wanted to show you another one of my, I don't know if you'd call it an accidental success. Another one of those plants that I only intentionally planted once. It is a variety of southern pea known as a Seminole pea, and not technically native to Florida, but does very well in our Florida summers. I believe it was actually, I believe it originated in Georgia. I could be wrong about that. Seminole tribes were throughout Florida and Georgia, so it could have come from either place. But anyway, planted these peas a few years ago, and they quickly took over the area that I had them planted, and in the time I was doing in-ground planting or in-ground gardening, and they ended up covering such a large area that I could not get into the garden to harvest them. So what ended up happening by the end of the summer, they were all producing the peas, and they are a dried pea, so you're supposed to let them dry on the vine. And of course the problem was, is as they dried on the vine, if I did not get them harvested fast enough, those shells would come open and the peas would end up falling to the ground. And what has happened is every year since, the beans have come back. So that's what I have coming up here, and it is actually going up the trellis. Now this is very similar to a cowpea, very, very small little hard peas that it produces. But you can eat these fresh like a green bean. You have to catch them very, very early while they're still tender, or otherwise you can let them dry on the vine. You harvest the peas, and then once you have enough, you can dry them and cook them like you would a cowpea. So I'm going to go ahead and let this guy go. He is, staying on the trellis and behaving himself, so I'm not too worried about it. And he's in an area that he actually doesn't interfere with any of the cucumbers that are doing well. So I'm happy to just let him do his thing. I have some others that are actually coming up in the yard that they're just kind of getting mowed over as they come up. So for the most part, I'm trying to phase these out, because we did discover that we're really not big fans of growing southern peas because they take up such a large area, and because you have to grow so much to get a decent number of beans to really be able to do anything with. So, okay, I think this is going to be the last bed that I have time to show you guys, and probably my biggest failure of the season. I did learn a lot of things from this garden bed, but I kind of took companion planting to the extreme, overplanted it, so that was my first fault. I had strawberries and garlic in here, which I do still have some strawberries going. I think what I'm actually going to do is dig up these strawberries and put them into hanging baskets. The bed itself is starting to settle a lot, and so I want to fill it back in with some compost and then some more mulch on top so that I can replant it for fall. And I can't do that with a perennial like strawberries. You can see this giant plant over here on the side is actually collard greens. Planted it on a whim. We are not big fans of collard greens, and hence why it is still here and has never been harvested. And by this point, just because it is so mature and it's getting so hot, um, I'm afraid that they're not even going to be decent quality, so I'm just going to end up composting the whole thing, unfortunately. One thing that I did learn that for the most part was a success was growing tomatoes up this trellis here. So this is another one of our trellis beds. The trellis itself is 6 feet tall, and we have the netting on it. And what I did was I had some tomatoes that were coming up in my compost. I think most of them were probably Cherokee purples, and so I ended up just planting them along the one side of the bed and then weaving them through the trellis as they grew. A couple of problems that I had is I planted too many, so they really kind of took over, and then also I did not thin them as they grew. So I really had too much overlap. There wasn't enough room for the leaves to breathe, get good airflow, and so we ended up with some fungal issues. But also, just going into the summer, we tend to get a lot of fungal issues with tomatoes. So I really can't fault the trellis itself for that. I do still have some growth here that is alive, and I even have it producing some tomatoes. Big problem that we ran into was just trying to keep control of the bugs. I actually went out of town for about 2 weeks. When I left, I had a ton of green tomatoes on these plants. They ripened within those 2 weeks. By the time I got back, they were rotten on the vine, mainly because of the damage from the bugs, but also because I had to take care of my garden, wasn't harvesting. So, tomato, tomato. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take these parts that are still alive, I'm going to trim them off the main plant, and I'm going to root them. And I'll do another video to show you guys how I do that. A very, very easy process for tomatoes. But I want to clean the rest of this trellis off. Again, just kind of reset this bed. I will rotate something else into this bed for the fall to use the trellis. Use tomatoes on probably one of the other trellises. But I really do think that I want to stick with trellises for tomatoes because they did so well with it. And I didn't have to worry about my supports falling over or anything like that. And then also, because the tomatoes were actually in a raised bed, the roots could go deeper than they would when they're in my grow bags. So they were able to just, I think, get a lot more nutrients and a lot more water during dry periods. So thank you for joining me on this quick little walk through my garden. As you can see, I have had plenty of my own failures this year. We had some successes too, and I'm going to show you our successes as we go through this next year. And hopefully this is a series that I continue for as long as I'm here. For as long as I'm gardening, I want to be sharing it with you. So please subscribe so that you can see what we're doing next month in August, and also so that you can get our how-to videos to help you on your own gardening journey and learning how to grow your own food. Have a good one.